The Passover is filled with meaning. Remembering how God delivered his people from bondage. For Jesus, his last Passover meant so much more. Once again, God was going to provide deliverance for everyone.
Whenever you talk about the life of Jesus, you get to the most important part. You get to his death, burial, and resurrection. And each gospel writer has a slightly different focus, and it can get confusing trying to harmonize all of those accounts.
The story of Jesus' final days are recorded by 4 different men in 4 different ways, and it is easy to kind of get lost. What I'd like to do is take a very close look at the final week of Jesus' life, and especially those final hours. I want us to retrace his steps. By visiting these places, I think you can have a different perspective of many of those events, and it'll help you understand the scriptures even more.
There's just so much to take in there. You have his betrayal, you have his arrest, you have the various trials that he goes through over a very short period of time. So to keep things straight and to maintain a continuity, we're just going to go from start to finish, from his triumphal entry down through his death, burial, and resurrection. To do all of that without stopping is going to help us comprehend where he was, what he was saying, and what was happening around him.
In Luke, the 19th chapter, it tells us about Jesus leaving Jericho after he had visited with Zacchaeus and the people there and going up to Jerusalem. And of course, he did this knowing that this would be the last time he would do that. And we were able to go to a location about halfway between Jericho and Jerusalem and look over the wilderness. The entire path would have been 14, 15 miles, and you gain nearly 3,500 feet in elevation, and there's no trees. So you are fully exposed to the sun the entire time. So this would have been a very difficult walk, even under the best of circumstances.
As we crested a path along the top of a hill, the whole valley just opened up, and all at the same time, it was beautiful and desolate.
There's a passage in Luke, the 19th chapter, that I really love. It talks about how Jesus left Jericho and went up the hill to Jerusalem. It's a simple verse, but when you know the road that he took, it causes you to think more about what's in that verse. I've done a lot of hiking, and I know that a lot of times it's hard to walk and talk at the same time. So my guess is, as he was going up that hill, he didn't do much talking. He probably did a lot of thinking. I wonder what he thought about as he walked. And he probably thought about the week ahead of him. And he probably thought about his family and his friends. And he probably thought about you and me and the sacrifice he was going to have to make for all of us.
Just a few miles up the road is the Mount of Olives, and we know that after he crested that hill, on his way down was the triumphal entry. Everybody was excited to see him, but we understand from other passages that he was anticipating their final rejection of him at the end of that week. He understands what's waiting for him on the other side of the Mount of Olives. And even though he's coming up and getting ready for the triumphal entry, where everybody is celebrating and they're getting ready to remember the Passover, there's still a part of Jesus that is apprehensive because of what he's looking forward to. I felt a sense of wonder as I looked at just how beautiful it was. And I also think I felt a sense of foreboding because I was trying to put myself in Jesus' position and imagining what he had to look forward to. As Jews traveled toward Jerusalem for Passover, there's a series of psalms that we have recorded for us in the Bible called the Psalms of Ascent. And they were the psalms that travelers would sing to each other as they traveled toward Jerusalem. And they're excited as they climb that road, cresting the Mount of Olives, and they're excited about the temple and the Temple Mount and God's presence. And so all of that anticipation is building as they crest that hill. Barry, we've made it to the top of the Mount of Olives, up from Jericho. This was a momentous event for Jesus. This is his last Passover. He's used to coming here, but this one's extra special for him.
That's right. We typically call this the triumphal entry. And it's interesting in verse 37 of Luke 19, it says, "And as he was drawing near, already on the way down the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of disciples began to rejoice and praise God."
Can we go and follow this path down into Jerusalem, similar to what Jesus did?
We can. Of course, the road that he went down is long gone, but there is a road that leads from the top of Mount of Olives down to the Kidron Valley, and that's where I'd like to go right now.
Let's do it. Now on that day, Jesus sent a couple of his disciples into town, and they came back with a donkey's colt for him to come and ride down this road on. They threw some cloaks on the donkey, people were throwing down palm fronds, and they were celebrating the coming of the king. They quote Zechariah 9:9. There's some people that tell Jesus to get the disciples to be quiet and stop saying things like that. And Jesus' comment was, if these people didn't cry out, then the very stones they were walking on would have recognized who he was and respond.
You can imagine them coming into the city and this beautiful view that they would have had. The temple would have been right there in front of them. They would have been able to see that as they were coming down the mountain. It would have been really beautiful.
Now there's a very big contrast between Jesus coming into Jerusalem on that day and that triumphal entry, and the triumphal entry of, say, a Roman general after a military victory. He's humble. He's not riding a beautiful war horse, he's riding on a donkey's colt.
Right, with people's clothes as the saddle.
You have Jesus continuing his humble, unassuming entry into Jerusalem. There's a church that marks one of the spots that Jesus wept over Jerusalem during the triumphal entry. And so in the midst of all that jubilation, Jesus is actually sorrowful because he's anticipating the rejection he's going to experience in just a couple of days.
Jeremy, this is the Dominus Flevit Church. Dominus Flevit is Latin for the Lord weeps, and of course we know the Lord wept many times over Jerusalem.
There are several times where he does that. The one that most people think of is at the end of that final week of Jesus, where he's been teaching, he's been in the Temple Mount, but during that triumphal entry, when everybody is celebrating about their king arriving in his city, he's actually weeping as he's riding that donkey down into town, because he's anticipating their rejection of him at the end of the week.
Yeah. Let's just go in here and take a look around. Jesus had visited Jerusalem many times over his life. In fact, when he was growing up, of course, his family would have come to Jerusalem 3 times a year. And so it's probable that he had been to Jerusalem more than 50 or 60 times during his entire life. But of course, this trip was different. He knew what lay ahead of him, and he knew what he was going to have to go through. He knew what was about to happen.